welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome. This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and it is fitting in a way that I don't want to say this topic is like evergreen because it's crazy, but with everything else that seems dystopian in today's society, this book, which is a nonfiction book, definitely fits into that, having grown up with like movies like Gattaca, which is name dropped in this book. So I'm going to stop talking about it and I'm going to let the author tell us what this book is about.
Great. Well, hey, thanks so much for having me on the show. So the book is about a lawsuit that was brought in 2009 that challenged the practice of patenting human genes, which companies and institutions had been patenting in the United States for about 20 years before that. And patents allowed one company, whoever owned the patent on a gene, to be the only one who controlled what was done with the gene, and even whether you could look at it and to find out whether you had a high likelihood of getting a disease based on your genetic makeup. You had to go to them to find this out.
This is absolutely crazy. And you begin the book talking a little bit about how I think there was a point in the 90s where this was a hot button issue with celebrities, including authors like Michael Crichton. How did you come to this topic?
So I'm a law professor and I teach about intellectual property law. So it was sort of right in my alley. And I have been following these issues for a number of years, since the Human Genome Project. And I and a lot of experts in this area, we knew that this was happening and just kind of accepted it as an unfortunate reality. The courts, the patent office had all said this is okay. And we figured, well, unfortunately, this is okay, but it's the world we live in. And then I and others who were watching this were kind of shocked in 2009 when the ACLU brought this lawsuit to try to end it.
So, just a history for those who need to know. Could you tell us a little bit first about the Human Genome Project?
Sure. Well, we all have a genome, right? Every one of our cells, in the nuclei of our cells, we have DNA. 3.2 billion links of it that determine a lot about us physically, physiologically, and so forth. And every organism has a genome, right? But it's very small, very complicated, difficult to decode. And it wasn't until the 1980s that we really started to be able to read the links in our DNA chain. And so around that time in the mid-80s, there was a big scientific debate about whether we should try to map out and sequence the entire human genome. Some very simple organisms have been sequenced before, but humans are obviously quite complex compared to bacteria and what have you. And so a large government project, multinational project, was developed to do this. And it was going to cost several $1 billion, very controversial. But about 1988, it got kicked off and it took a long time and there were lots of twists and turns. It was a very dramatic race to finish it. And by 2003, we did have kind of the basic map of the human genome.
Which is that's just so crazy. And I know that I remember hearing about it, and there's so much that can be done with science, and there's so many good things that can come out of that. But then there's these unexpected things. So what are the ramifications? What are some of the things that were being argued as this being sinister? Because I'm sure that there is a counter a counter argument that like, oh, well, is this really so bad? Even though literally when you talk about companies owning your DNA, that sounds like evil overlord stuff right there. So can you talk a little bit about the arguments each way?
Sure, sure. So patents, we've had patents in this country since the very beginning. They're baked into the Constitution. First Patent Act was in 1790. And these are generally good for society, right? Somebody builds a new kind of a boat paddle or a plow blade or a mousetrap, right? Then the government will grant them a patent so that for some period of time, it's now 20 years, they will be the exclusive one in the United States that can make, use, or sell that invention. And the theory is that exclusive period, when they're the only one in the market, gives them the opportunity to recoup their costs, right? It might have cost a lot of money to develop this thing. And drugs are the example that are used the most. It costs $1 billion roughly to bring a new drug to market after, like 7 to 10 years of FDA trials and approvals. So, there's a lot of arguments about drug pricing, and I don't want to get into that just yet. But, drug companies need something to recoup the costs of all of that R&D. And if they didn't have it, we'd probably have fewer of those innovations, right? So that's the basic theory. Against that is theory that, look, stuff that just exists out in nature, you can't patent it, right? Because you didn't invent it. Patents are for invention. So you go out into the jungle, you find a new type of a moss or a flower or something that, turns out to have healing properties, right? That's great. You can patent the use of that moss to, cure burns or what have you, but you can't get a patent on the moss itself, right? Like a new composition of matter. So if you invent a new type of rubber or synthetic fiber like rayon or polyester, or a new super hard steel, you can patent those things. And then when you get that patent, all of the uses of that new type of steel, you own those, right? And nobody can do it without your permission because you invented the thing. And the really weird thing that happened here is that back in the 80s, the patent office and the patent bar kind of agreed that they would treat newly discovered human genes as new compositions of matter, like polyester or rayon that somebody invented in the lab.
That's wild.
Yeah, and it's this very lawyerly argument that they all convinced themselves was right, but in the human body, we have something like 20,000 genes, but they're all strung together, right, on these 23 chromosomes, like more than 1,000 genes per chromosome. If you break out one of those genes and amplify it in the laboratory to analyze it, well, then you've got something that doesn't actually exist in nature, right? The isolated gene isn't floating around in your cells. It's all strung together. But most geneticists will tell you that's ridiculous because it is the same gene. It's just separate in one instance and connected to other stuff in the other instance. You still didn't invent it, yet that is how we treated it for about 20 years in the US.
So some of the people you talk about Lori Andrews, who I thought was really interesting. Did you actually, so who did you interview to kind of get like a good map of this whole book?
Oh, so this book, I spent 8 years sort of tracking down all of these leads, and I interviewed almost 100 people. Almost everybody in the book I spoke to personally, interviewed some multiple times. There were a few people who didn't return my calls, right? So Angelina Jolie did not return my calls.
Oh, but she was such a spokesperson for this.
I thought she might honestly respond, and Barack Obama did not respond.
Ah, Barack, come on.
I know, but beyond that, almost everybody else did, and so I really did. My goal was to tell a true and accurate story as much as anything else, and so I really took some time to try to get that right.
So, I mean, one of the hot button issues that always comes up, when you're talking about situations like this, everybody's weary of cloning and designer babies, which I think, is that's certainly the sci-fi, but more speculative fiction aspect of it. But there's other um, things that come up with the idea of gene patenting beyond that. Like you were saying, companies being able to tell exactly what diseases you could be prone to. What are some of the arguments around like the fear of that being part of this whole lawsuit?
Yeah, and so it was more than a fear, it was a reality. So this particular lawsuit, the ACLU and the Public Patent Foundation, they wanted to attack gene patenting, but they had to choose particular defendants, right? You have to choose one company in a lawsuit to go after. And the company that they chose and the patents that they chose were patents on two genes called BRCA1 and 2, right? And these genes, if you have, every one of us has these two genes, but if you have certain mutations in those genes, you have an extremely high chance of getting breast or ovarian cancer, like many times more the general population. And we knew this, right? As society, these results had been published in the literature. And so scientists all over the country and all over the world knew to look for these mutations. And then you could tell a person, usually women, if they had this extremely high risk of getting these cancers. But because this company, Myriad Genetics, had patented those genes, they basically shut down all of the labs and clinics in the country that were running this test. And they were the only ones left who could perform the test. And they decided to charge, depending on the time, between $3,000 and $4,000 for the test. And most insurance policies did not cover it, at least in the beginning. Medicaid didn't cover it. And so you have a lot of women who have a family history of breast cancer, or who actually got breast cancer themselves and then wanted to know if they had these mutations, because if so, then they probably are going to get ovarian cancer very soon and might need prophylactic surgery to prevent themselves from getting ovarian cancer. But they couldn't get that test because it was so expensive. And that was really one of the major issues motivating this lawsuit, is access to health and women's health.
It's just crazy to me in general. First of all, just the idea that one company can have a monopoly over something that could save lives, but then at the same time thinking about how things work. It's not all that surprising that they would want that. But just also, like how many things could be prevented if that was more widely used. I mean, clearly, like if this is not covered by Medicare, then the people who cannot afford to really seek medical help and really are probably more at risk. And then you have the overall idea that it's pretty much like piracy, like they're boarding your ship and they're holding you up and saying, you want to know if you're going to get sick, you have to pay us, which is nuts.
Yeah, well, exactly. And especially because it's not a new drug that this company invented. It is literally the DNA sequence, like in your own body, that you're not allowed to, or literally no one anyone who like reads that sequence is like violating the law.
So what are some interesting things that have come out of this suit so far?
Well, so the case was heard by the Supreme Court in 2013, right? This is the history. The Supreme Court mostly sided with the ACLU and invalidated these patents, both for this company And for all companies, right? So all of these patents on human genes in one fell swoop at the Supreme Court got invalidated. And that has had a lot of different effects, good effects, I think. First of all, for breast cancer and ovarian cancer, the price of screening has dropped dramatically. So that now, today, even if you get $125 23andMe test, they'll tell you if you have the major BRCA mutations. And, I wouldn't go out and use 23andMe as a basis for getting like surgery.
Right.
You can take it to your doctor anyway, and they can decide if you should get more advanced testing.
Yeah, and that's a whole other thing altogether. I think there's a lot of buzz about whether or not those companies are using your information for sinister purposes. I know, like, everyone and their mother is swabbing their cheek and doing 23andMe. So it almost felt like, reading this, I'm like, okay, so people weren't really able to necessarily do this, but now just everyone's just willingly like, here, take my DNA, tell me if I'm related to Vikings, because that seems to be what everybody wants to know, and then all the rest of your information is out there.
You're right. And that is kind of the flip side of this set of issues, right? So certainly, like Myriad and 23andMe, whoever it is, they discover something interesting in your DNA. They won't own it, right? And they can't get a patent on it. They can't prevent you from using it. But you can't prevent them from using it either, really, right? The information is kind of out there.
Yeah, and that's a whole other can of worms altogether. Although I think the information, maybe it's just me, but maybe the information being out there isn't so bad as somebody holding your DNA hostage or holding your treatment hostage because they've patented something that shouldn't.
Yeah, you're told they're different, they're related problems, right? But they're different. And we do have laws around privacy, right?
Right.
And so I think the property pathway, right, that these companies use to patent things seems wrong, and that really led to a lot of people not getting the treatment that they needed. I mean, I think our job now is focus on the privacy side of things, right? Don't go back to property, but we do need strong privacy protections, right? So that somebody can't just publish it on the web, right? And say sort of, we discovered in your DNA you've got whatever likelihood of getting this disease, right? You don't want people to know that,
right,
necessarily. So they shouldn't be able to do that. And we're still working out how that works, right? I mean, luckily, 23andMe and so forth are still voluntary.
right.
And I know I've got lots of family members who will never do it because they've got those kinds of concerns.
Yeah, I think another concern I've heard about this, and I think this is a whole other legal thing altogether, is whether or not the insurance companies can use this to kind of say, well, we can't cover you because you're prone to this, which again, it was interesting while reading your book. I was like, okay, there's this, and then there's also this whole other side to it, which is maybe like what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. The law is always playing catch up to new technology. So we do have a law in the United States in 2008 that it's called GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And it goes part of the way there, right? It prohibits employers and health insurers from discriminating against you based on your genetic makeup. But it's got some holes in it, right? It doesn't cover life insurance, it doesn't cover disability insurance. And it doesn't cover some types of employers. So it's, it's partially there. But people have been worried about this, absolutely. And yeah, we're not done yet. There's the story is still being written.
So it took you 8 years to write this?
Yeah, not working nonstop, but I started before the Supreme Court decision came out, just knowing that this was really going to be important in a set of issues that, the general public, it was important enough for the general public to know about, but the coverage was either very brief in the news media or, very biased. And so I thought, yeah, this really should be a book. And, as I wrote it, I kept finding out more and more interesting details about the case and how it progressed and all sorts of machinations behind the scenes in the administration as the case was going on. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, so that took place. So you said that the case was brought up in 2009 and was heard by the Supreme Court in 2013. So that was, I was trying to remember whether or not that was within the changing of a presidential administration but it was in the Obama era. Yeah.
Yeah, as the Obama administration, although there have been more recent developments. So in 2019, during the Trump administration, a couple of senators introduced a bill to try to overturn this case, which Congress is permitted to do, right? That's how
Right. Yeah.
our branch system of government works. The Supreme Court rules, and Congress, if it doesn't like the ruling, it can change the law as long as it's not doing something unconstitutional.
Right.
It can do that, and that effort kind of petered out in 2019. Things like COVID came along to distract us all.
Yeah, that put a monkey wrench in a lot of things.
And obviously there were a lot of other health related issues in Washington, but it's back, right? This effort is back. The same senators requested this summer that the patent office do a study of how these Supreme Court cases are affecting industry. And of course, the biotech industry doesn't like these decisions.
Right.
And, it's likely that we'll see something in the next session of Congress that might try to undo some of these results again.
That's really crazy, but I guess not 100% unexpected. And it's good that, this book, one of the things I really liked about it was that it was very easy to read. It wasn't, and I think that, if you're listening and this topic interests you at all, you don't get weighed down by a lot of legalese or a lot of scientific babble, even though that's important. It explains things just in a very digestible way, and in a way that I think readers will really absorb.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what I set out to do. There's a lot of academic and scientific writing about these issues, but I mean, in my experience, most people had no idea about it or that this was even going on. And so this book, I mean, I've really tried to tell the stories of the people who were involved, the lawyers, the judges, but also the patients, right? I mean, there are, some of the patients became plaintiffs in the suit and played a really big role in making this happen.
So are you going to be working on another book?
This one took long enough. I think, probably something coming down the pike, but at the moment, this only came out at the end of October. I'm still sort of breathing deeply, after this project.
Yeah, that's the end of October. That was 2 years ago, and the COVID times, every minute is a month.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, this was really good. I think, like I mentioned, this book was very readable. I think anybody who is interested at all in patents of, gene patenting, or, even on a sci-fi level, if you want to know the real story, sometimes the truth is more wild than you would expect. So the Genome Defense is already in libraries and bookstores, and it's a great nonfiction read. It's going to keep you interested, and it's stuff that you should know because as you mentioned, this is not the end.
Exactly.
Well, once again, thank you so much. I'm Jessica from Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest was
Jorge Contreras from University of Utah.
and we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.